First of all, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself to you all. My name is Rebecca Jackson-Harrop, and I'm the Interim Engagement Manager here at Vantage Point. In this role, I manage our talent team of what we call knowledge philanthropists or skilled volunteers. It's this team of 140 knowledge philanthropists that allow us to work with over 500 organizations like yourselves each year. In my spare time, I'm on a working board for Friends of the Vancouver Public Library, where I also act as the volunteer engagement lead. And I serve on as a committee member for a local running club. Now, a few technical housekeeping items before we start. First of all, there's no webcam, so you won't be seeing our smiling faces today, I'm sorry. And everyone here is muted, so we will ask you to engage with us via the chat box today. Yes, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar with you, as well as the slides at the end of this presentation. So not to worry if I go over something too quickly, or you miss something, or you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you will have access to the recording to review at your leisure. If you have any technical questions, you can type them into the question box. My lovely colleague Vicky is here today to help deal with any of those situations. And what you type is private, and we'll do our best to type back a written response as soon as we can. If you have any questions or comments about the content, please do share them. Just so you know, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the session for you all. Today, we will also be joined by two lovely guest speakers who will be sharing real-world examples with you and wisdom relating to organizational engagement. And you will get to enjoy a nice break from my voice. I will be providing a proper introduction to Anthony Azar and Mark Boals later in this presentation. So for those of you that might not have engaged with Vantage Point before, just a couple notes about us. Here at Vantage Point, we envision Canada's not-for-profit sector as a thriving community where every organization mindfully engages talented people, or those knowledge philanthropists that I mentioned earlier, in order to achieve their missions. We move towards this goal by delivering foundational learning, such as this webinar, advanced learning, and custom learning opportunities, such as strategic planning and board governance. These are focused on leadership, governance, planning, and people engagement for both new and seasoned leaders and board directors. Last year, we engaged over 100 knowledge philanthropists to deliver learning to 2,991 leaders, from more than 500 organizations across BC. Our learning is immediately applicable, so it can be readily put to use in the wide variety of organizations that you lead. So just to provide you with a quick overview of what we'll be covering today, first, we're going to delve into what employee and volunteer engagement is and why it's important to your organization. Then we will share with you a well-established engagement measurement tool called the Gallup Survey, and we'll go through the 12 questions it asks in detail. Next, we'll explore the stages that teams can go through and how these stages can significantly influence the level of engagement you're experiencing on your team. Lastly, we'll discuss how delegation can be used as a tool to foster greater levels of engagement. And we'll be aiming to end this session by 2:30 p.m. today. So some of you know, the way that we work with volunteers or knowledge philanthropists here at Vantage Point is we really do treat them as members of our team. So in some instances, I will say employee, and when you're working with skilled volunteers, a lot of these same ideas are applicable in both contexts. So I'd just like to flag that. So let's clarify, what is employee engagement? We've got a couple quotes here for you. Let's clarify from the outset here that engagement does not mean employee happiness or satisfaction. Employee engagement goes deeper and looks at the emotional commitment the employee has to the organization and its goals. This emotional commitment means engaged employees actually care about their work and their company. They're not just working for a paycheck or the next promotion, but they work on behalf of the organization's goals. When employees care, when they're engaged, they use something called discretionary effort. Examples of this discretionary effort include, for instance, the engaged computer programmer who works overtime when needed without having to be asked. This means the engaged retail clerk that picks up the trash on the store floor, even if the boss isn't watching. This means the TSA agent will pull a suspicious bag to be searched, even if it's the last bag on their shift. Engaged employees and volunteers will go above and beyond time again for you because they care about the organization. In a sector where we may or may not have an abundance of time or money, if everyone is putting in this extra effort, it can really impact the amount of work we are able to do as a team. Now, let's look at the impact this has. I'd like you to keep in mind and reflect on a time when you yourself were stuck in a bad work or voluntary situation, or a low engagement situation. How did that feel for you, and how did it impact your behavior? Conversely, I'd like you to reflect on a time when you were in a situation where you loved going to work every day. You cared passionately about the organization or cause and its success, or were in a high engagement situation. How did that feel for you, and how did that impact your behavior? Using yourself as an example here, we can see that the same person can show up each day in very different ways if they are not engaged. One thing I'd like us to think about as we go through here is how it is that we as leaders are tapping into this motivation and fostering a culture of high engagement so that people are bringing their best selves and efforts each day. And why is this important to us as organizations? To provide some more concrete examples of how levels of engagement influence organizations, meaningful and balanced work life is becoming more of a driver of job choice. This means it will help you attract great people. Engaged employees show less stress and take fewer sick days. Employees who find meaning at work are more competent, committed, and contributing. And it leads to increased customer satisfaction and client commitment. Hands down, organizational outcomes are better when employee engagement is higher. Now at this juncture, here to provide some information to reinforce these points and some examples from his own career, I would like to introduce Anthony Azar. I'm so pleased to have Anthony here today, as he is currently the talent specialist for an organization called Traction on Demand. Anthony is passionate about developing the talents of others, and he's the guy always asking, can we do this better? He shares with us today his extensive experience in HR, as well as a number of years acting as president of a sporting board called Out for Kicks Soccer Club.
Well, what's really important to understand is it's not a prescription. Being engaged is this and check off a bunch of boxes and then it just happens. It's definitely more of a journey as opposed to a destination, and something that you need to, think about on a regular basis. And so some considerations that I want you to think about is, how consistent are you when you're engaging with the different employees and volunteers that you have in your organization? Managers and leaders have a huge effect on employee engagement, and probably one of the biggest effects that they could potentially have. Organizational changes tend to drive a lot of change with engagement, and so is there something going on in your organization? Has there been layoffs or some sort of volume hiring or any other large organizational change? People are really a dynamic resource. If you hire somebody today, 6 months from now, they're going to have very different needs and kind of hopes and dreams for where their career is going to go. And so we need to continually think about how people are changing and what else they might want to be doing or where their interests have changed, and be responsive to that. So the next piece here is really just some statements that you might hear a really engaged employee say, or kind of a thought that they might have. So I'm just going to kind of run through these statements really quickly to give you an idea, but it might sound like, how can I complete this assignment more quickly or with more value to the organization? We've had a setback on the project today, and I know it will actually end up making this project more effective. I know that my customers would really love if I change this about my style, so I'm going to go and incorporate that into my next interaction. And I know this information will be valuable to my teammates, and so I'll share it at the next opportunity. So really focused on being forward-thinking and driving the organization's performance forward as a whole, as opposed to being a detractor. And these would be statements of more a disengaged employee. So I'm really not in the mood to do this task. I guess it can wait till later. We have so many problems in this organization. This project is just a prime example. I'm sure it's just going to be a complete waste of time. My customers are so demanding. There are so many other important things I should be doing, and they're just a waste of my time. Or when can I go home? So essentially, looking for any reason to not get the work done, to not be in the organization, not want to engage with other stakeholders. Pretty common reaction. Great, so I wanted to introduce this little model to you guys, and really it's just a way of understanding employee engagement. It's based off of a psychology model called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you don't need to know in order to understand this, but similar basis. The idea is there are several levels in this pyramid diagram, and essentially, like a highly engaged employee would be somebody who is at the very top of that pyramid. But in order to get to the top of the pyramid, each successive layer needs to be satisfied for them to get to the top. If any one layer is no longer being met, then that employee would dive down to whatever that level would be. So I'm just going to walk you through some of these levels and kind of describe to you what it might look like. So at the very bottom, the first level is really the survival level. And so the basic things for survival are, employees are getting paid, obviously, but not just pay, also the idea of pay equity. So, do they feel like they're being fairly compensated for the work that they're doing? By no means does this mean that, you need to pay them exorbitant amounts of money, but it comes down to more of a fairness type idea. The other idea behind survival is really interesting work as well. And again, interesting is kind of a vague term, but it has to do a lot with what the employee kind of sees as interesting work. Once an employee has that kind of survival piece done, they would move into still a not engaged level, but they'd be looking for something called security. So security is really about are they getting the amount of hours they're looking for? Are they a permanent versus a contract employee? Has somebody been laid off or moved out of the organization and makes them maybe feel a little uncomfortable, or that they might potentially lose their job? And so that's all in there as well. Manager relationships start to come into effect here, but really they just need to have a manager and then they would be happy in security. If their security is there, then they're moving into this belonging stage, which is kind of an almost engaged level. Belonging is really about their connection to their team and the engagement they have with the company culture, whatever that might be. Also their trust, the trust that they're forming between employees and themselves, and the recognition that they might be receiving from their peers as well as their manager. So if they're getting all of this stuff, then they will create the sense of belonging, which will move them into kind of the second tier there, the engaged level. So, engaged employees, really what we're aiming for. Some of these statements, I'm not going to read them underneath the categories of highly engaged, almost engaged. Again, are thoughts of what an employee might think or say. But when we get into that importance level, in order to get to kind of like the highly engaged employee, this importance level really has a lot to do with their relationship with their manager. So what is the frequency of communication between the employee and the manager? Are they being really honest with the employees? What is the employee's impact, or ability to impact what a manager is thinking? Not necessarily, I think they just want to have input and feel like their input is valued. Obviously, managers want to set direction for your employees, but taking into account, the experience that they bring to the table, I think is really important in building that sense of importance for them. Another important piece there is really their trust in the organizational direction. So are they really on board with, where the organization is going? And so if that piece is satisfied, then we would move into this highly engaged employee. It's kind of the idea of self-actualization. So they're in this state of active engagement where an employee would really seek to push the organization forward by driving innovation, by doing their job better, by supporting other employees, and by thinking about how they can, make other employees better, not just themselves. So I just wanted to throw that at you, and then we're going to review a case study, one that I've done previously, or not done previously, but one that's very close to my heart. So I used to be a store manager at Starbucks long ago, and so I wanted to pull an example from there to really go through this model and to make it more real for you from a realistic perspective. So I want you to think about this case. And I think the reason I picked this one, and it's a situation that I've seen in many organizations before, not just in Starbucks, but I think it's one that will probably, for many people, would resonate. So we're going to talk about a store at Starbucks and them going through a manager change. I'm thinking of a particular Starbucks that I used to work in and then transitioned out of, and but knew it very well. It was a very well-run Starbucks shop, and I'm sure you can envision that kind of a store. You walk in, maybe the barista already knows your name and your drink. They're super friendly. You typically get a great drink. The service is efficient. It just really has that warm feeling in there, and I'm hoping that all of you guys have been to one of those stores. I know that I have. From a business perspective, they were doing great, hitting all of their targets and key performance indicators, and it was really one of those kind of shining beacons in the land of Starbucks, where a model store that people could really think about when they were really thinking about what a great store could be. But then the situation was that they had a really great manager there. That manager had the opportunity to take a promotion and did, and so they moved a new person into the manager's role, and they were new in role, so their skill set was just sort of learning and developing, and so the store started to change, obviously, but unfortunately it went downhill pretty badly. The employee engagement really plummeted. The friendliness started to go out the window, then followed by some inefficiencies, and then the employees really started to turn over and became more of a revolving door. This place that used to really kill everything from a performance standards perspective really wasn't hitting those things anymore, and it just didn't feel good anymore. And so, like I said, the story has happened several times before, but I really want to go back to the model and talk about why this happened, and so it becomes really clear. So, let's just think about this if we look at the model. So, previously, these employees were all in kind of the top two tiers there, so highly engaged and engaged, doing a really great job. And then the manager changes, and so what happened there? So, first of all, importance was definitely lost. The new manager came in, didn't take the time to build trust with the new employees, and stopped involving his staff in a lot of the exploration on how to best achieve business objectives. And so many of those staff would have moved into the almost engaged level. But then a lot of them felt this loss of belonging as well. As managers stopped recognizing their staff, made some errors on some strategic plans, which really decreased team morale because they stopped hitting targets, they stopped feeling good about working there, and many people in the team started to not enjoy working with each other because they just weren't getting the job done as well anymore, which is then moving people down to more of the not engaged level. And so as some of these employees start to cycle out of the organization, then it becomes a question of many other employees who are there feeling like their security could be in jeopardy. So you've gone from highly engaged to engaged, and after all these things happen, really moving down to the not engaged and disengaged, which is a really bad place for this sort of be. And this happened over the course of maybe 3 or 4 months. So yeah, a little bit of a tragedy. I guess the silver lining to this whole thing is to think about, they cycled from a very highly engaged place down to disengaged or not engaged in a pretty quick time frame, which can be scary. But the upside of that is that, if your organization is struggling with engagement, you are able to move the engagement quite quickly by really focusing on it. And so the flip side is possible, and then you can make some really great changes in a short amount of time as well. So I just wanted to give you a couple of takeaways just from my little segment here, and thinking about engagement as a journey. And so I think it's really important that organizations measure employee engagement regularly. There's many different ways that you can do that, but I think having a finger on the pulse of how people are feeling is important, so that you know when and if you need to change what you're doing. Really engage your stakeholders in action planning so that they feel like they're involved. Obviously, to engage them in the process, that means you need to educate them as to what's going on. You don't necessarily need to do everything that they're asking you for, but I think if they're involved and you show that you're taking into consideration their ideas, then that goes a long way. And then again, just be super aware of the impact that organizational changes can have on engagement, and maybe think about what you can do to preempt some of those changes in order to make sure people are feeling okay.
Thanks, Anthony. I think it will be very useful for us to keep Anthony's example in mind as we move through the next portion of this webinar and cover the Gallup 12 survey. So now that we've explored what employee engagement means and why it matters, let's move on to a great tool to measure employee engagement, the Gallup survey. Having a better understanding of the drivers of our engagement helps us focus on building those into our leadership style and organizational culture. There are a number of different models out there for employee engagement measurement, and you may have your own, but we're going to look at this one that's considered a gold standard in the industry, the Gallup 12. More details about this model of employee engagement, if you really want to nerd out, can be found in the book First Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham and Kurt Kaufman. The work to measure employee engagement actually first took place in the 1950s when a researcher named Dr. Clifton began studying work and learning environments in order to determine the factors that contribute positively to those environments and that enable people to capitalize on their unique talents. It was through this early work that Dr. Clifton began using science and the study of strengths to study individuals' frames of reference and attitudes. In the 1980s, Gallup scientists continued to increase our understanding of engagement by studying high-performing individuals and teams. Over decades of testing, Gallup arrived at a set of questions that were consistently found to measure the aspects of employee engagement that link to business outcomes. Gallup tested thousands of questions on millions of employees to find the right questions with the exact wording that provided the highest correlation to business results most companies regularly measure, such as profitability, productivity, turnover, and safety. Today, more than 25,000 people have completed the survey in 93 countries, so that's a lot of data. The 12 questions are powerful indicators, not just of employee satisfaction, but actionable areas to improve performance and engagement. What's interesting to note is that the Q12 are closed-ended. That is, you cannot add any comments or reasons to explain your response to a particular question. Instead, the power of this data is in the conversations that take place after the survey results come in, conversations that you will lead with your team. It's important to remember that as we go through these, employees and volunteers need to own the results and desire to change as much as you do as a leader. So let's take a look at the 12 questions. What these questions address are different types of needs. These could apply to volunteers, board, and staff, but sometimes in different ways for each group. The first 3 questions speak to a baseline of engagement that must be met before other areas can be addressed. This cluster is really the bare minimum required. You can imagine that if the answer to these questions was no, the employee responding to them might feel frustrated, confused, and disengaged. And you can see that even if the answers to the other questions were positive, there might still be problems to be addressed. So if you're just starting on the journey of measuring and building engagement, this is where you might want to focus first. The second cluster looked to individual needs. Here, what we're driving towards is a greater appreciation or understanding of individual purpose and connection to their work. These questions are a way of getting to the heart of how valued, supported, and connected an individual employee or volunteer feels in their work. People are motivated by many things, such as praise, personal connection, and encouragement. The third cluster addresses teamwork needs and organizational culture. These are a reflection of how other volunteers or staff members show up for their work. It's about team cohesion, focus on purpose, and shared expectations around behavior. The fourth is growth needs or development. These speak to motivation and alignment between your goals and the goals of the volunteer or staff member. In the next section, we're going to look at each of the questions individually. And as we go through this section, I would encourage you to think about how employees or volunteers in your organization might respond today. So question 1, do I know what is expected of me at work? For individuals and teams to be aware of their expectations, they should have a way to rank, rate, or count as many of the desired outcomes as possible. Also, these measures of performance should fit with what the rest of the organization is saying and doing. People want to see how they fit into the big picture. So tangible strategies here include holding annual performance plans with goal setting and measurable targets. And great workplaces are going to have defined the right outcomes for their people, set goals with their employees and teams, and they don't just define the job itself, but define what success on the job looks like clearly. In question 2, do I have the equipment and materials to do my work right? Make sure teams know how to earn the right to certain materials and equipment. A great way for teams to increase their responsiveness to this question is to determine what materials and equipment means to them. Sometimes they're referring to accessibility of information rather than specifically to materials and equipment, materially. Great managers and leaders are going to find out what materials and equipment people require. They're going to know when to place the responsibility for this on individuals and teams. Question 3, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day at work. It's vital that every individual understands his or her strengths and weaknesses. A good way of promoting this is to discuss what each person believes his or her leading strengths are in terms of skills, knowledge, and innate talents. Writing these strengths down often helps. Great leaders are going to keep each individual's talents in mind, focus on building solid relationships, and really help individuals in uncovering and identifying their own unique talents. Question 4. In the last 7 days, I have received recognition or praise for doing good work. Many wonder how often people should be praised, but a good rule of thumb is about once a week, as indicated by this question. Here's why. Whenever a person does something, there are consequences. Those consequences will affect whether teams engage in that behavior again. We know that to get the results or consequences we want, frequent praise can encourage the behavior that produces it. So positive reinforcement to the max. Great workplaces are going to use forms of recognition that are specific, predictable, frequent, and instantaneous. They're going to promote a recognition-rich environment. Praise is going to come from every direction. And everyone knows how others like to be recognized. This is important as not everyone will respond well to public praise or recognition. So just to give you an idea, here at Vantage Point, to ensure this recognition comes from all directions, we've created something we call the Crown of Awesome. And it's really cost-effective recognition practice because it's basically a silly paper crown, but we pass it on to recognize our teammates. Once you've been bequeathed with the crown, it's your job to pass it on to one of the teammates and acknowledge someone else. Based on who that teammate is, the crown gets passed on individually, or to those who are not, for those who are not comfortable with public praise, or it very often shows up in our bi-weekly team meetings to recognize someone's work in front of the team. So question 5, my supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. Remember, and I think Anthony's example did a really great job of reinforcing this idea, people lead managers, not companies. Teams are prepared to give the manager and the organization the benefit of the doubt. None of this can happen if teams don't feel cared about. Relationships are the glue that holds great workplaces together. So great leaders or managers are going to make people feel safe to experiment, to challenge, share information, and support each other. Knowing that relationships are the glue that hold great workplaces together. Question 6, there is someone who encourages my development at work. In this case, development does not mean getting people promoted. It does not mean each team member gets what he or she wants necessarily. Great managers and leaders are going to find roles to fit natural strengths of individuals, recognizing their unique combinations of skills, knowledge, and talent. They're going to provide constant feedback and encourage team members to do so as well. And they're going to find creative developmental opportunities. This means listening to the goals of our teammates and thinking about their unique strengths, and then giving them the chance to learn new skills, connecting them with mentorship opportunities, or engaging them in a stretch goal or project. Question 7, at work, my opinions seem to count. Teams do not function very well when the team members feel insignificant or irrelevant. This means everyone should have a chance to express his or her ideas. Defining opinions counting as being heard or being implemented. Great managers are going to maintain access to channels of communication across different levels of the organization. They're going to ask individuals and teams for their opinions, and they're going to include their ideas in the decision-making process whenever possible. Question 8, the purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. So mission alignment here. This question measures a key source of motivation for teams. The idea that their organization represents values that they themselves share. As human beings, we like to feel as though we belong. Individual achievement is great, but we're likely to stay committed much longer if we feel we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. And as not-for-profits, this is something we can really tap into. Great workplaces are going to provide constant clarification of the overall mission of the organization. They're going to align the work of each individual to the achievement of the mission. Question 9, my fellow employees or volunteers are committed to doing quality work. Teams that score well in this question tend to be good at providing clear quality standards and keeping those standards at the forefront of their team members' minds. We also know that not everyone will see quality in the same way if everyone's concept of the word is different. To remedy this, having a clear definition really helps. The best place to start is with customers both internal and external. High-performing teams are capable of accurately evaluating their own performance as well as that of their teammates. Great leaders know that accountability builds trust among coworkers. So great leaders are going to maintain clear communication of standards. They're going to define and demonstrate what high performance actually looks like, and they're going to keep people accountable. Question 10, I have a best friend at work. I have a best friend at work is really just a proxy for trust. We are interested only in whether there's a person at work whom you would consider a best friend at work. Chances are you're going to feel like there is more open communication within your team if you have a best friend at work. You're going to feel more confident in making decisions, taking risks, and being more productive because you don't have to spend a lot of time feeling like you're watching your back. Engaged employees have someone they trust who shares their values and are watching out for them. They have open communication within their teams, and they don't feel as though they have to watch their back. Question 11. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. One of Gallup's most consistent research findings has been that feedback improves performance. We realize that we all need feedback to know how far we've come. We need signs to track our progress. So great leaders are going to establish structured feedback processes for their team. They're going to meet regularly with individuals to track progress towards goals. And they're going to understand that feedback improves performance. And last but not least, question 12. This last year at work, I have had opportunities to learn and grow. Engaged teams need to feel that their job contributes in some way to their professional or personal development. Each workgroup member will define opportunities differently. For some teams, this may mean training classes and seminars. For others, it might mean promotions and increased responsibilities. And for others, this might mean working on special projects or assignments. Great workplaces are going to provide educational and skill-building opportunities. They're going to mix up formal training with newer stretch projects, and they're going to encourage mentoring and shadowing where possible. So now that we've looked at this measurement tool, I think it's important to note that these kinds of tools have become a more popular barometer, but not the only indicator on its own. An annual survey wouldn't tell us that much. It's a snapshot in time and doesn't get to the root causes of what's going on. Looking year over year, however, can be a lot more helpful once you've got a bit more data there. Something else to keep in mind is that the survey responses could vary depending on time of year they were taken, where the organization was at that moment, and where the team was at that moment. So it's important to treat this data as a symptom of great culture rather than a cause. You don't want to manage the metric and forget about why and how employees become and stay engaged. Instead, try to manage the culture, the practices and processes that support these highly engaged employees. Where there are gaps after you've taken the survey, there are opportunities to have the necessary but difficult conversations to address them. One technique you might want to consider is using a state of the team plan to define what good looks like in the Q12 for your team. And doing this as a team can be really powerful because changing culture is not just a one-person task. This isn't all on you as a leader. It's really about sharing ownership of the results with the rest of the team. So it's crucial that the employees or volunteers own their role in this. Now we're going to move into what stage your team is in and how that might influence engagement. These stages are a helpful way to think about where your team is right now and why you might be experiencing a certain level of engagement. So I don't know if this model is familiar to people out there. It was first introduced by Bruce Tuchman back in 1965, and it's remained a popular way of thinking about how teams evolve and change over time. Keep in mind that this evolution is always ongoing, and why, as Anthony mentioned earlier, we need to treat engagement as a journey and not a destination. So first of all, we have forming. In this stage, individuals are just beginning to come together. Here, leadership from the manager is critical, and individual roles are quite unclear. Processes are not yet well established. People are often very polite in this stage and not openly expressing their opinions. From here, we move into the storming stage, and at this point, the team understands how they collaborate to make decisions, and the group's purpose is clear to everyone. But their individual roles remain blurry. This blurriness can often lead to some productive conflict as teammates sort out these roles. They might not yet recognize the unique strengths that they each bring to the table. Then we have norming. The dust has settled a bit here, and relationships are well understood by the team. There's a group commitment to the team's goals, and the team has begun to optimize their processes. Lastly, we have the magical stage of performing, where the whole team is committed to performing well. Their focus is on being strategic, and in this place, managers do not have to provide much oversight. Everyone has embraced the leadership they can provide at their tier of the organization. I'd like to note that sometimes the model has a fifth stage, which is mourning or adjourning. This can often happen for teams that are more temporary in nature, or when a group is working on a particular project that has come to an end. It's also important to note that every time you add or lose a team member, you might go back to an earlier stage of team development, because that really does shake things up. What's crucial to remember here is that high-performing teams align personal strengths and goals to organizational goals, which leads to higher engagement. So if you have a team that's newly formed and still in the storming or forming stages, you may have lower engagement than a more mature team in the norming or performing stages. There's nothing wrong about wherever you are organizationally in these stages, and know that you can cycle between them frequently. Now, knowing what we know about teams and how they come together, let's shift to talk about what happens at the peak stage when we see high-performing teams, because that's the goal here. Patrick Lencioni has spelled out 5 key attributes of high-performing, cohesive teams. He's the author of 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and he says that high-performing teams trust in team members, engage in unfiltered conflict, so conflict as a productive thing here to keep in mind. They commit to decisions and plans of action, they hold one another accountable, and they focus on achieving collective results. We have conflict and collaboration highlighted on the screen because they're often flip sides of the same coin, engaging different opinions, skills, mindsets, or experiences to produce better results for the team. So let's start by focusing on collaboration. Collaboration can be looked at through these 6 components. All contribute to a collaborative team process. Shared goals and interdependence are central to teams. Accountability speaks to the level of accountability that any team member accepts for the shared results of the team. Collaboration means taking responsibility for the team's contributions. Character, or integrity, is found in the way that teammates work with each other and the level of respect they show one another. Commitment is the way that members invest themselves in the work being done and go beyond concerns about personal gains. And finally, authentic communication attacks issues, not people. This type of team communication is open, honest, non-judgmental, non-evaluative, and builds trust and safety for all members. But sometimes collaboration is not as easy as it seems. That's because it requires us to pivot and think about opportunities, projects, and decisions from a new perspective. It requires us to draw on opinions, insights, and strengths of others. And that's not always easy to do. In order to be a collaborative and successful team member, we need to be able to not only see a situation from our perspective. If you look at a beach ball from the side, all you'll see is blue, maybe a bit of orange and yellow. But what about red, green, or white? If you look at the ball from the top, we're able to see all the colors and all the perspectives. This is collaborative team membership, looking at a conversation, a meeting, a project, a challenge from the perspectives of everyone, or keeping the whole beach ball in mind. At this point, I'd like to turn over the mic to our other guest speaker, Mark Boals, to provide some real-life examples of what teams can look like in these various stages. Mark is currently a faculty member of Royal Roads University, providing instruction in the coaching and workplace innovation faculty, as well as acting as the principal of One Project, which provides executive and leadership coaching. Mark shares with us today over 30 years experience facilitating, teaching, and training, and his mission is to inspire and trigger a new type of leader in the world, mobilizing the emerging leader through audacity and self-mastery. Mark also has experience to share with us today from his extensive involvement in the sporting sector, where he was an athlete development advisor for CSI Pacific. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mark.
I first want to say thank you to Rebecca and Vantage Point for allowing me to sit and participate in this and bring some things that I hope will help you leverage and help you layer some things on to what's already been explored on here. I just want to quickly revisit some things, because for me there's some real nuggets that have really showed up since the beginning, and hopefully everyone's heard some real key words that have been used since the very beginning of the webinar. I keep hearing the word trust. I keep hearing things around safety. One of the real rocks here is that piece with engagement around meaning for people. So whether you're board, whether you're parent, staff, volunteer, whatever your role is on here, bringing the context of those key words and bringing your best self, as it was explained early on, each day, is really a critical piece in this stages of team development. I'm going to share with you some examples, and I just want to sort of step back a little bit because I want to just quickly revisit some things that Anthony had said and Rebecca had said, so we frame it as we move forward here. And it really is about the conversation, and we've heard that, the conversations around how are you engaging with each employee. In other words, that touching point to learn more about them, and it gets back to that conversation. Anthony shared with us, and this is going to be a really important piece when we look at these stages of forming and storming and norming and performing, is these pieces around the pyramid and where trust resides in that pyramid. That think about as you go back to that image that Anthony shared around that place of engagement and that place of survival. As we go through to take a look at engagement, the conversations we have with people are really leveraged in that area of trust and in that survival place, and we'll talk about that. Anthony talked about building trust in his example of Starbucks. So, moving forward here in that linkage with the Gallup poll, amazing questions in this Gallup poll. And when you think about disengaged workplaces, if you think about it in terms of a dollar value, the billions of dollars that are lost in the workplace due to disengaged employees is, if I want to say, just ridiculous amounts of money through disengaged. As leaders, we have within us the ability and the strength to have these conversations and lean into these types of things as we've heard so far. So I would challenge you to take a look at that Gallup, those 12 questions, and how they actually sit. Take those 12 questions and challenge yourself to where do these questions reside within the forming, the norming, the storming, and performing stages, as well as where do they reside within what is part of this adjourning piece as well, as that fifth one that was, I think it was added about 10 years after the initial one. So it's it's shifting these conversations to this place of safety. So some examples of, you know, embracing the opportunities to engage. So when we think about the forming piece of leadership, when we think about that, think about the strong presence that's required to share that message, to, you know, inspire and, you know, I'll use that word, mobilize the people to see what you see. That's going to be very important across the clarity of your message to ensure that. Because what you're wanting to do during that forming stage is allow people to feel a sense of risk-taking, creativity is okay, and celebrating the ability that they have to make contributions. You want to build that. And as Rebecca referred to in the slides, it's that newness. There's a massive amount of energy in people wanting to be part of something. So when it comes to this forming piece, is thinking about behind this energy what resides within each person, going back to what Anthony and Rebecca have said. Each person, what do they bring? What do they contribute? And in this norming stage, this is where some organizations, and I'll give you some examples here in a second, is thinking about, you know, what can we do within the leadership, within our organization, to really embrace this forming piece as a real integral piece, knowing that as we shift through with the team development and we shift into the storming, what do we have opportunities to do in front of us that will allow the storming piece to move through without getting stuck in it, but we are developing the abilities and the competencies of our people to manage within the storming piece at a much higher level. So as an example, working with an organization, I was actually called in. They wanted to do some team development. They were stuck in the storming. They were stuck storming. It was not apparent that there had been a lot of development around, going back to these slides, around this piece, around being able to have trusting conversations, being able to deal with this conflict, be able to resolve these, and remain positive and see it as an opportunity. Those pieces were really important. So what we needed to do was step back, and as Rebecca talked about, you know, to me this is a dance. You could be in storming. We shifted back to the forming. We had to reform and refocus, because within the storming, the lost objectives of why, the big why. And I believe it's Simon Sinek that talks about what is your why. So we had to get back to why are we here as a team and explore that, but then provide them with the skills to have the conversations and have the tools to deal with moving through that storming stage where they're allowed to excel and there's acceptance. And it's that acceptance and of each other's uniqueness, and that word's been used, of how that happens. So it's starting to develop those characteristics of, you know, that jockeying. People are wanting to demonstrate their competencies. People will go about demonstrating those. Rebecca referred to the acknowledgement piece or praise. I talk about it more from an acknowledgement piece in the work that I do, because what we want to do is acknowledge the person and how their behaviors are positively impacting the performance of the team. When we think about the acknowledgement piece within this, this is where we have to be very clear in the forming stage of how do we communicate this. And I completely agree with Rebecca on this piece of, I've seen team members completely disengage when they're acknowledged in public. And now our challenge is to re-engage them and build back the trust that we will acknowledge them in different ways, because now they're hidden. We've lost the opportunity for their talents to be involved. So where does that start? that awareness up front with the team and understanding your team. So getting back, so this organization, we had to step back. It allowed us, once we developed the skills, to move through to the storming stage. That they stayed there for a while because they had the tools now to be able to start to sort themselves out, to develop that piece within them through the leadership. And we also provided that opportunity for them to learn how to give constructive feedback, meaningful feedback, not just things that I would refer to as junk food feedback. You know, the attaboys and, you know, yeah, nice job. We all know junk food is real great. I love it. We all know those Miss Vickie's bag of salt and vinegar chips for anybody that rides a bike. They're great after a long day and sweat, but we know it doesn't, on the long term, it's not going to do us any good. So we want to be, and we want to support people in providing meaningful feedback that when somebody hears it, they value the comments made, and it allows us to support people moving forward. So this is a really invaluable piece as well. So in this storming, so then it becomes the norming piece. And so what that allowed us to do is we managed to shift through that storming piece much more smoothly and allowed us to get into the norming stage where we were allowed to start shifting the accountability pieces. So the leadership, and they started to own the results. The team started to own these results. Now, when it comes to the accountability piece, it is the transfer of accountability to where it belongs. My philosophy around accountability is it needs to be shifted to where it belongs, and I've had this conversation with many colleagues, is by taking away the accountability from someone, you are taking away the opportunity for them to embrace the feeling of what it's like to strive and achieve for something. So we want the accountability to be there, and then sometimes we have to ask the question, how do you want me to hold you accountable? How do you want me to support you through this? What is that going to look like? So we start to have the conversations. Now, if you've got a team, it's going to be different for each individual. But wow, having individual conversations and as a collective, as a team, to understand how each needs to be held accountable, what are the roles we play within that, all those types of things become a real powerful shift in terms of how do we deal, how do we deal with resilience? What's my level of resilience, and how do I deal with this piece? So we start to develop that level of trust. And so as we get going through there, then the performing piece is, as Rebecca talked about, we are moving. There's an ongoing evaluation, the energy's there, the creative, and everybody's in agreement how this is going to work. Now, the opposite occurred with another organization. They wanted to develop teams. And before we developed the teams, we did some assessments. Now, some of these assessments, and I talked to Rebecca about this, if we're going to use assessments, we have to be very careful with what those results and what the language of the assessment means for people. So if we do assessments, some assessment tools that are out there, whether it's in emotional intelligence or strength development inventory, different tools provide different things. So be very clear. It's like testing athletes. Why do we want to test? And as a result of this, what are we going to learn? So we want to take that assessment, and we can actually build teams of people based on what the assessment is telling us and who are the best individuals for a certain project. Those people will not get that assessment until they meet face-to-face. So with the assessments that I'll do, they won't get the results until we have a pre-scheduled meeting. So we're very clear on what the results mean. We go through the language, we go through it, and develop a plan for moving forward. So before we even started, we were very clear heading into the forming stage what we had as a collective group and a much greater understanding of the characteristics, which provided the clarity for us to move forward. So some really key things to think about that you, as a leader, can set up in advance. So those types of things become important. So it's, think about how you could potentially build your teams and build the engagement pieces around your professional development plan, individual growth plans. Now I know Rebecca and in here we've talked about sort of the annual reviews. I love doing it in the moment. I love live discussions, and that probably comes for me because of the passion I have from coaching. Is in the moment when we're seeing things around growth and development, having these conversations versus an annual. The mindset is, for me, working with people, shifts to a completely different and more open place. So we want growth. We want to challenge our people. We want to try and do as much in the moment, live, if you want to say live conversations, as much as possible. Pairing people up, mentorship was mentioned. I would suggest potentially with new people coming into teams, this is something else we did. We had identified mentors with specific skills that when new people were coming in or going based on the job itself and requirements, that we had a buddy set up, mentor buddies set up to guide them through the process to minimize pulling things back to a storming stage with a new member. So we wanted to, if you want to say, coach people through the growth. And it becomes a language within the culture of the organization. This is how we go about the business of supporting and stretching and growing our people. It becomes a language of how we do the business. And everybody it becomes part of it. So thinking about the stages of the teams, swing back to the Maslow, where does it fit? Swing back to the survey, and how do those things and where do they fit within the stages of team development? Just one final thing that becomes that I would really encourage within this the forming stage is rules of engagement. Is come up with the rules of engagement as a team. How are we going to operate? How will we communicate with each other? What's our commitment to each other as we move forward? And that will allow, it's almost like a contract within to support each other moving forward. So it really helps frame things of how you will go about the business of managing yourselves in that environment.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think that rules of engagement piece is particularly powerful and a great idea for sort of expediting getting people beyond that forming stage of the team. So keeping Mark's examples in mind, I'd like to move us to the flip side of our collaboration conflict coin that we were exploring earlier, which is embracing productive team conflict. So rather than thinking about conflict as something to avoid or something that only emerges in moments of crisis or stress, I encourage us to think about conflict as something that can be actively embraced as a way of strengthening the team and your shared outcomes. I think it's important to recognize that not all conflict is created equally. There's an important difference between dysfunctional conflict and the productive conflict that I'm hoping to highlight here. Dysfunctional conflict is dissent that lacks an effective channel. It often leads to resentment and strained working relationships. Dysfunctional conflict may be rooted in more personal issues, whereas productive conflict is driven by values and can be seen as a commitment to goals, much like that shared commitment that Mark was just talking about. Unlike dysfunctional conflict, productive conflict is expressed as divergent thinking that illuminates different ways of understanding a situation or challenge. So really teasing out the green and red and white of that beach ball. Productive conflict can be a way for us to get in touch with our beliefs and motivations. Leaders need to embrace conflict in a way that centers on process, not personalities. Conflict can be used as a tool for driving towards a deeper understanding of our core values and creating new solutions to challenges. So here we'd like to share with you some tips for teams to embrace productive conflict. So number one here we have is to appoint a devil's advocate. Empowering people to take on the difficult roles can take the stigma away from them. Someone whose excellence is demonstrated by the quality of questions they ask. Great questions can include ones such as, what are the best reasons not to do this? What don't we know that, if we did know, would change our decision? If we had more money or time, what would we do then? It's important that different people play the role of devil's advocate and get to take turns. If it is always the same person, and you know who that person is, they'll get tuned out and burned out. The person with the role of identifying gaps has the specific job of listening for what is not being said. If the conversation is being framed about money, consider what is not being talked about. If everyone's talking technology, what have they left out of their equation? Sometimes it's helpful to bring in an outsider to help with this. They should do nothing but listen. Then you can ask for their impressions, not recommendations. They may be able to notice trends that people embroiled in the conversation can't. 2, imagine you cannot do what you all want to do. In other words, think about what you would do if you could fire someone, if you could change the timetable, or if you were allowed to cancel the deal. If you could do any of those things, would you still proceed with your plan? What are the hidden assumptions and orthodoxies nobody is challenging here? And 3, after a decision is made, declare a cooling off period. Ask everyone to go home and think about the decision on their own. Come back after a prescribed amount of time and ask the group, does the decision still look great to everyone? And embracing productive team conflict, I think, can really harness the power of that storming stage. Now that we see the power that productive conflict can have on raising the level of engagement on your team, let's talk about building engagement by sharing leadership with others on your team using the power of delegation. Delegation gives others a chance to try something out with you as the coach to support through it. It's a tool for building engagement, professional growth, and development, and creating opportunities for new ideas to surface within your team. It provides those key development opportunities we discussed as critical in the Gallup Survey questions. For delegation to work well, we as leaders should follow a process that sets our teammates up for success. First, we need to identify the opportunity at hand. Then make a decision about the appropriateness of delegating it to someone. We're going to discuss this in greater detail next slide. Then identify who on the team would be best set up to participate. Define the boundaries of the opportunity as this role clarity, as well as clarity around expectations for determining success. This we mentioned earlier as well in the Gallup 12, is really critical. Lastly, ensuring that we as leaders are checking in and communicating. This is not a sign of distrust, but a show of support to those that we're delegating to. And there's a final stage on there too where you get to celebrate the success of your delegation. So what might hold us back as leaders from delegating? We all know that this can be a bit of a struggle sometimes. I think it's important to acknowledge at the outset that delegation might not be the right strategy for every situation. Instead, it's important to keep in mind what the goals of delegating are and to think about what is out of bounds for us. So why don't we delegate? Well, it may be difficult to begin delegation as it requires a lot of time investment at the beginning. It really is an initial investment. There's a learning curve, so staff or volunteers may make mistakes as they become familiar with a new process. This can be scary. There's also sometimes concerns that some tasks are too important to be delegated, or there's a risk of lack of accountability. What's at stake here? It feels like if we delegate and it does not go well, there will be consequences for our leadership or to our organization. But there's also consequences, and this is the point I'm trying to hammer home, of holding on to too much and not delegating. Others don't have the same opportunities to grow, gain new skills, feel aligned with the mission and vision, or become stronger ambassadors of your organization, aside from potential burnout of you as a leader. We have a few points in this chart to help you make this decision and conduct what I'm calling a gut check about delegating. Times you may want to consider holding off are when it may result in a breach of confidentiality. You are the public face of your organization, or you truly are the only one with the skills required. Otherwise, I would highly encourage you to consider delegating where possible. So with all of our learning here at Vantage Point, we encourage our participants to develop a meaningful action plan as a result of their learning with us. So based on our discussion today, I'd suggest you define the Gallup Q12 in your terms with your teams. You could potentially get them to identify if they were to make one change in one of those areas now, what would have the biggest impact on the team. You could brainstorm action ideas, identify what, by who, by when, and then add check-back dates 3 months, 6 months from now. Engaging your employees or volunteers and board members can be a powerful way to increase your impact as an organization. Focusing on engagement through conversation or through measurement is a great way to shift your culture towards one where employees feel valued, supported, connected, and contributing. I'd now like to invite you to submit any questions you may have into the chat box, and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can. And you'll get the benefit of pitching them to myself, Mark, or Anthony. All right, so the question we have here is how an executive director can help guide a volunteer board through this kind of process. And I'm just going to pass this one off to Anthony because we haven't heard from him in a while.
Hey guys, thanks for the question. How can an ED work on it with a volunteer board to do engagement? And yeah, I was actually thinking about this. So my company Traction, we actually do a lot of work with not-for-profits as well, but in the Salesforce implementation space. But yeah, I was talking about how there's certain pieces of using Gallup that would make sense, less so for a volunteer base. But I think engaging them is definitely about communication and making sure that, again, you find out where their interest lies. I think Vantage Point does a really great job at engaging their volunteers, because they're reaching out to see, what is of interest for us to be doing. I'm sure, you've got a volunteer base that's quite passionate about giving back, and, I don't know much about your organization, so it's hard to give you specifics, but, having a regular communication pattern with the volunteers, I think, would be great, and just kind of reaching out and letting them know, what you're working on and the skill sets that could be of interest to you, and see if there's anybody else out there, or maybe a volunteer knows someone who might be able to help you with those projects. I think is a great way to start. And for the volunteers that are kind of regularly engaged with your organization, again, kind of maybe doing some sort of survey with them, not exactly Gallup, but finding some other way to find out, how well they're being engaged, and if there's something else that they'd like to do for the organization or more information they might want. Sometimes it's just about providing more clarity and transparency around what the organization is doing for them to feel more engaged.
And I'm just going to jump back in here as well. So we actually do on our Vantage Point Resources Center, there's a spot where you can download a number of free resources and tools of ours. We do have a board assessment tool there that might be helpful in conducting kind of a check on the level of engagement with a volunteer board. All right, and I have another question here, and this one I'm going to put to Mark. The question is if we could recommend any tools for regular communications or recommend ways to set up projects to ensure that an entire board gets involved. And I think this could also apply to teams.
It's a great question, and I think the challenge is the tools are just that, as a tool. The key would be almost going back to what Anthony talked about, is what is the communication like with the board around what exactly is it that you want to get from the tool itself. As I say, there are many tools. Some are very expensive. Some are free. And I'm sure, Rebecca and Vantage Point can lead and share some information on some of the tools that are readily available. And the second part of that question, Rebecca, was?
Just jumping back on here, and then I'll repeat the question for Mark and get him back on. A tool that we're in the midst of developing right now that we're going to put out is basically when you're looking at your operational plan, including a column in that where you designate who in the organization is going to do what. And that bakes the people into your organizational plan. So I know we're going to develop that and get it out as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. And then the second part of the question, Mark, was recommend ways to set up projects to ensure an entire board gets involved or an entire team gets involved.
Yeah, when it comes to getting everyone involved, I think that's where it gets to the clarity of, what are the traits that they bring. So I know working with some boards, there's clearly the board members and the selection of the board members have been done through strategically to bring certain skill sets. And so that can really help lend itself to what are the things that we have, what are the resources we have the capacity to take on, and do we need to look outside of this to get that extra skill set and knowledge? So, building that within, definitely important to have the board on board and supportive of the initiatives or the project. And, is there a point person? And are the roles really clear on, again, going back to this piece, are the roles really clear on the communication flow? What are the questions that need to be answered? What are the processes for communication? And what is the information we need on an ongoing basis to feel connected to that project? What would that look like and think about the trust involved with the board feeling connected to the project. What needs to happen that things are moving, and what support and role can they play? So definitely the clarity of roles and the communication are going to be really, really important in moving forward.
And I'm just going to jump back in here and wear my board member hat, actually, to answer this question a bit more. I know something we've done on our working board, so everyone's a volunteer, to decide who's going to do what, is we structured ourselves into committees, and we've had everyone, based on their own interests and the strengths that they've identified as wanting to use as a board member. You definitely don't want to be forcing people to be doing activities maybe that aren't within their roundhouse or they don't feel equipped to do. That self-identification process happens when they decide which committee they're going to sit on, and then projects and tasks get assigned to the committees, and then you're kind of working on a smaller team that way so that you can communicate with one another about what style or regular communication tool you want to use, whether you're convening together regularly in person, or you're hopping on the phone, or you're using email or some other platform to connect with one another. And then we have tied that into our larger sort of operational plan, which I mentioned earlier, as a way of sort of checking back with each committee to ensure that they have that feeling of accountability. In terms of some additional resources, you may want to consider visiting our resource center that I flagged earlier as having a board assessment tool. There we have an employee performance review toolkit, as well as some other volunteer engagement tools and board governance resources. We also have an upcoming open enrollment here at Vantage Point workshop called Human Resources, Developing High Performers that might be a fit. And then we have a couple other the book I mentioned earlier, and Gallup's website to draw your attention to. So thanks to everyone for joining us today and your patience with some of our technological glitches. I really look forward to seeing you at other Vantage Point learning opportunities, and I'd just like to thank our guest speakers again for doing such a great job today. Thanks, everyone. See you.